For 4 years, the city of Philadelphia swallowed every trace of Rosalind Sabatini, and for 4 years her face hung on billboards along the riverfront avenue, until the winter rain ate the features away and left nothing but a pale smear and a hotline number that no one had bothered to call in a long time. Divers dragged the bottom of the Delaware 3 separate times, each time until the cold took the feeling out of a man's hands, and all 3 times they brought up the same things: silt, rusted, mooring chain, and a silence so heavy that nobody standing on that barge could bring himself to meet another man's eyes. 37 private investigators took their checks one after another, and one after another laid thick folders on his desk that were hollow all the way through, while a $500,000 reward, left standing through 4 winters, drew in exactly one kind of man, the kind who lies extremely well. That morning, in a gray stone church in South Philly, the man whose name nobody along that waterfront said out loud put his pen to a petition declaring his own sister dead, and he signed it fast. And those who were there say he never read back a single line, because reading it back would have meant there was still hope, and hope was a thing he had already paid for in full. The pen left a heavy blot at the end of his signature, right where his hand held 1 beat longer than it needed to, and then he folded the paper, handed it to the lawyer standing at his left, and walked out into the sunlight, like a man who had just closed the last door of his life. But not one person in that church knew that the girl had been pulled back from death 4 years earlier, on a June night at Pier 9, in that late hour when nothing moves on the water but the sound of it slapping the pilings, when a body was lifted out of the cold river with no identification, no one beside her, and no name to write in the first blank line of an admission chart, and they wheeled her into the intensive care unit of the poorest public hospital in the city, where the only nurse on the floor that night was 23 years old. And over a stretch of time longer than any emergency she had ever worked, those 2 gloved hands pulled the girl back from the other side. The sky had not begun to lighten when 2 men walked into that unit, calling themselves family, asking for the patient's name, their leather shoes without a single scuff on them, and the hospital had not released word of any admission at all. And that nurse did the one thing she had never done in her life. She lied, changing the room code and misspelling a single letter in the file. That one letter would keep the girl alive for 4 more years, and that same letter, 4 years later, would bring down an entire empire. What Rocco Sabatini did not know was that his sister had never once left this city, that she was still breathing the same air, still walking beneath the very billboards that carried her face without a single soul recognizing her, for a reason no one would uncover until 4 years had passed. And when the man finally uncovered it, he understood that he himself had paid for it to happen. And what that nurse did not know was that the man who had put the girl into the cold water that night was, on the very morning her brother signed the death petition, eating breakfast within arm's reach of the most powerful man in Philadelphia. If this story stayed with you, leave a like, share it with someone you love, and subscribe to our channel so we can keep walking these journeys together. Maeve Donnelly came off the night shift at St. Ambrose Mercy in that gray hour, when the city has not yet decided to wake, and she walked the whole way back to Kensington, because the fare cost more than the shoes she was wearing were worth, and those shoes had worn down unevenly on the outer edge, from years of standing on hospital tile. The cold came up off the pavement through the thin soles and settled in her ankles, and she did not think about it, the way a person stops thinking about weather that has been there long enough to become furniture. Her hands still carried the smell of the alcohol wash, a smell that never fully left her skin anymore, not after showers, not after sleep. She let herself into the narrow, rented room on the 2nd floor of a row house, with a low ceiling and a heater that rattled unless somebody folded newspaper under one corner of it, and somebody had, the way somebody always did. The coffee was already made. It was too weak, the way it was always too weak, because the young woman who made it every morning measured the grounds by some private system that had never once matched the instructions on the can, and Maeve poured herself a cup and drank all of it, the way she did every morning. Ada Pike had fallen asleep in the armchair by the window, with her chin on her chest, and her reading glasses still hooked over one ear. 68 years old, retired off the same hospital floors 30 years before Maeve ever set foot on them, and she stirred when the door closed, and said something about the night being quiet, and then went back under. 4 years earlier, that young woman had come out of 11 days of unconsciousness in a hospital that had no record of who she was, and when she opened her eyes there was nothing behind them but the present tense. And the state of Pennsylvania did what the state does with a person who arrives without a history, which was to place her in a long-term care facility outside the city for adults who cannot be identified. A low brick building with a parking lot full of weeds and a hallway that smelled of steam and industrial soap. Maeve went out there every week for 14 months. Not almost every week. Every week, through 2 winters, on days off and on days that were not days off, taking the regional line as far as it went, and then walking the rest, sitting in a plastic chair beside a bed and talking about nothing in particular to a young woman who did not know her name and did not know her own, until the state cut the budget for facilities of that kind and closed the building and sent letters to families, and there was no family to send a letter to. What there was instead was a temporary identification card issued by the county, and because the intake had happened in June, and because a person cannot be filed under nothing, the card read June Doe. And then there was a petition for legal guardianship, filed in the family court of the county by a woman who was 24 years old at the time and made less in a year than the cost of the surgery she would eventually be told her ward could not have, and the petition was granted for the simplest reason in the world, which was that nobody else on the face of the earth had filed one. That night the shaking started a little after Maeve got home. She heard the change in the breathing before she heard anything else, and she was up off the floor and across the room before her own thoughts had caught up with her body, moving the chair back with her hip, going down on one knee, turning the young woman onto her side with a hand flat between the shoulder blades and the other guiding the head. She folded her coat and slid it underneath. She cleared the space around her of anything hard. She did not hold her down, because you never hold them down. And she did not put anything near her mouth, because that is a thing people believe who have never had to do this. She counted. There was no clock she could see from where she was kneeling, so she counted the way she had learned to count in a hallway, with no clock either, against the low cycling hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, one full turn of the compressor and then another, and she watched the color, and she watched the breathing, and she kept her voice level and low and steady the whole time, saying the same few words over and over, and she did not need to think about any of it, because it had happened before, and it would happen again, and this was simply the work. The seizure was longer than the ones before it, long enough that when it finally let go, Maeve did not wait for morning, and she got the young woman into the wheelchair from the closet and pushed her the 11 blocks to St. Ambrose Mercy herself, because an ambulance would have cost more than a month of what she brought home. The lobby at that hour belonged to the floor waxers and the vending machines, and she went in through the main doors because the side entrance had been locked since the renovation, and she took the long diagonal across the polished floor, past the wall on the east side, where the hospital thanked the people who had paid for the new wing, a wall she had crossed so many times over 4 years that it had stopped registering as anything at all, the way the tile pattern had stopped registering, the way the smell had. There was a run of brass plates along it, and above them, cast in dark iron and mounted flush against the stone, the mark of the Sabatini Foundation, a piece of scrollwork, 2 curved bars turning back on themselves the way ornamental ironwork does on the old houses in the southern part of the city. The chair rolled past it, and June went rigid. It was not like the shaking. It was the opposite of the shaking, a sudden hard stillness that ran up through her shoulders and locked her hands on the armrests, and her chin came up an inch and stopped, and her breathing went shallow and stayed there. Maeve had her out of the chair and flat on the floor in under a breath and a half, one hand under the head, calling down the corridor for the resident on call, and she never once looked up, because there was nothing above her worth looking at, because everything worth looking at was on the floor in front of her going white around the mouth. Dr. Hollis Brandt came down 40 minutes later. 60 years old, a neurologist who had spent most of his career at hospitals that could not afford him and had stopped explaining why he stayed, and he looked at the imaging for a long time without saying anything, and then he turned the screen so she could see it, and told her what she had already known for 6 months without letting herself put it into a sentence, that the pressure inside the skull was climbing, that the old injury had left scarring that was doing what scarring does, that the episodes were coming closer together and lasting longer, and that there was a procedure, and that the procedure was not optional in the sense that waiting was also a choice with a known outcome. He did not soften it, and she was grateful for that, because she had watched hundreds of people be softened at, and had never once seen it help. She asked him what the window looked like. He said months, and then he said that he had seen months mean a great many different things, and he told her to get the paperwork started, and he did not tell her that the paperwork was the part that would break her, because he did not know yet, and neither did she. They kept June 2 nights, and sent her home with the same medication at a higher dose, and a printed sheet of instructions written for somebody with a home and a car. 3 days after that, On a Saturday afternoon, with the light coming in flat and yellow through the one good window in the room, June sat on the floor with her back against the bed and drew. She always drew the same thing. In 4 years she had filled the backs of envelopes and the margins of hospital pamphlets, and one entire spiral notebook that Ada Pike had bought her for $2 at the pharmacy, and it was always a gate, tall and narrow, ironwork curling back on itself, in a pattern that had no name that any of them knew, and she could not say where it came from, and had stopped being asked. But that afternoon she drew it, and then she kept going. Down near the bottom, 3rd bar in from the left, she bent the line. She drew it pushed inward, out of true, the curve of it broken, and shoved back toward the hinge side, and she went over that one line twice with the pencil until it was darker than the rest, and then she put the pencil down and looked at it with an expression Maeve could not read at all, and said nothing. Maeve picked the paper up. She looked at the bent bar for a long moment, without understanding why her chest had gone tight. And then, standing in a rented room in Kensington with a piece of drawing paper in her hand, she remembered a wall she had walked past 1,000 times and never once seen, and the floor seemed to move very slightly under her feet, the way it does on a dock when a wake comes in from a boat that has already passed. The house on the south side of the city had been built by men who did not expect to be liked. 3 stories of gray stone taking up half the block, with windows set so deep in the walls that the glass sat back in shadow even at noon, and the rooms inside stayed dark and cool in every season, so that a man coming in off the sidewalk in August felt the temperature drop against his face before the door had closed behind him. In the long room at the back, there was a table that seated 20. It had been made for a family that no longer existed in the numbers it had been built for. And for 4 years now it had been used only at one end. A single setting laid at the head of it every morning by a woman who had worked in that kitchen since the previous generation. The other 19 places bare and polished and waiting for nobody. Rocco Sabatini sat there that morning with the folded copy of the petition still in the inside pocket of his coat, and he had not taken the coat off, and no one had asked him to. The telephone rang at the hour it always rang on that day of the week, and he picked it up and listened without speaking. On the other end was a man in Bridesburg, who had once walked into a room with a story about a girl seen at a bus terminal in Harrisburg. A story with a date in it, and a description of a coat, and who had been paid for that story, and had spent the money before anyone learned there had never been a girl and never been a coat. Rocco had not touched him. He had bought the man's debt, and then the lease on the man's shop, and then the account at the care home where the man's mother lived, and then he had let the man keep all 3. There was one condition. Once a week the man had to call this number himself and say the lie out loud, the whole of it, the terminal and the date and the coat, in his own voice, and then hang up. He had been doing it for 3 years and 4 months. He would do it until he died. Rocco listened to all of it without a word, the way he did every week, and set the phone down, and pushed the cup 2 inches to his right so it would sit where he wanted it. Desmond Falk was already at the other end of the table with the ledgers he brought on Thursdays. 53 years old, thinning at the crown, rimless glasses, a gray wool vest he had worn some version of for as long as anyone in that house could remember. He had taught the boy at that table how to read a balance sheet when the boy was 19 and grieving and could not sit still, and he had stood at his left shoulder at the father's funeral, and he was the only man alive who called the head of that family by his first name in front of other people. He came down the length of the room with the pot and filled the cup Rocco had just moved, and set it back exactly where he had found it, and asked whether he had managed any sleep. Rocco said that he had. Desmond said that was good, and did not believe it, and did not say so. Out past the kitchen and the yard and the wall, 16 blocks south, there was a pier that belonged to them, and 3 warehouses, and an arrangement with a shipping concern whose loading schedule had once been stopped for an entire afternoon because a man in this house had not liked something, and nothing had been said out loud to accomplish that. No call had been placed, no name had been used. That was what the money was. Not cars, not anything you could photograph. It was the thickness of a wall, and the silence of a telephone, and the fact that a dock crew of 90 men would stand in the cold with their hands in their pockets and wait, and none of them would ask why. Rocco drank the coffee. He wore no watch. He had not worn one in 4 years, and everyone in that house had noticed, and not one of them had ever asked him about it. The first envelope came on a Saturday, which Maeve thought was a strange day for a decision like that to travel, and she read it standing in the vestibule with her coat still buttoned. The determination ran to 2 pages, and the language was careful, and it never once said no. It said that the requested procedure could not be authorized as medically necessary at this time because the submitted record did not establish a documented progression of the underlying condition, and that the reviewing physician had found insufficient longitudinal history to support the requested intervention, and that the decision could be appealed within 30 days, provided additional supporting documentation was furnished. She read that last part 3 times. Additional supporting documentation. Because the record began 4 years ago in an emergency department with a blank line at the top of the chart, and everything before that line did not exist, not in a filing cabinet anywhere in the country, not in a doctor's notes, not in a childhood immunization schedule, not in a single sheet of paper on the face of the earth. Dr. Hollis Brandt had told her the pressure was climbing, and Dr. Hollis Brandt had been right, and the insurer had never met the young woman and never would, and what the insurer had asked for was proof of a past, and the one thing on this earth that Maeve could not obtain at any price was a past. The second envelope was taped to the front door, and it was addressed to all tenants, and it was 4 sentences long. The owner had entered into an agreement for the sale of the entire row. The transfer would close at the end of the following month, and existing month-to-month arrangements would not be continued by the purchaser. 2 pieces of paper, one afternoon, and both of them polite. Ada Pike made split pea soup that evening and put in far too much salt, which she did whenever her hands were not steady, and when it was ready, she set 2 bowls on the table and said she had eaten something earlier at the pharmacy counter and was not hungry, and she sat with them anyway with her hands folded. 68 years old, telling a lie so old and so worn smooth that it had stopped being a lie and become a kind of manners. June came in near dark from the Saturday class at the community center attached to the church on Somerset, with wax under 2 of her fingernails and a smear of blue along the side of her hand, and she was talking before the door was fully open. There had been a boy at her table, she said, who had colored a dog entirely green, and when the woman running the room asked him about it, he had explained, with some patience, that his own dog at home was exactly that color, and that everyone else had simply not been paying attention. June laughed, telling it. She helped set out the bowls, and she said the class had run long because nobody had wanted to stop, and she said it the way a person says a thing that has made them useful. It was the only room she ever came home talking about. Later, when the dishes were done and the heater had settled into its rattle and both of them were asleep, Maeve went out and sat on the concrete steps with the 2 envelopes in her lap and did not open either one again. The block was quiet. There was a streetlight 2 doors down that had been out since spring, and a car alarm going somewhere over toward the avenue, and the cold came up through the step and into her, and she sat there long enough that her feet went numb and then stopped being anything at all. She thought about the appeal window and the 30 days and the phrase insufficient longitudinal history, and she thought about a low brick building with weeds in the lot that had closed because of a line item in a budget she had never seen, and she thought about how many rooms she had walked into over her working life where the family was in the hallway crying and there was still a job to do inside. She was not crying. She had not cried in a very long time and did not particularly trust the impulse when it came. What she felt instead was something narrower and colder and more useful, the feeling of a person doing arithmetic and not liking the result and doing it again anyway. Somewhere in the 3rd or 4th hour of that, the arithmetic came out the same way it had come out every time, which was that there was exactly 1 door left in the city that she had never knocked on. She sat with that. Then she stood up. The offices of the Sabatini Foundation occupied the ground floor of a building on Market Street, with a lobby floored in pale stone and a ceiling high enough to swallow every sound a person made in it. And Maeve came in on a Tuesday, in the clothes she owned that came closest to being the right ones, which were the clothes she wore to guardianship hearings. The young woman at the desk was polite in the particular way that costs nothing. She said that the foundation reviewed grant inquiries through the online portal and that walk-in appointments were not something they were able to accommodate. Maeve said it was not about a grant. The young woman said that the foundation reviewed grant inquiries through the online portal and that walk-in appointments were not something they were able to accommodate. Maeve said that she worked at St. Ambrose Mercy and that it concerned a patient. The young woman said, in exactly the same words and exactly the same tone, that the foundation reviewed grant inquiries through the online portal and that walk-in appointments were not something they were able to accommodate. And then she looked back down at her screen, and that was the end of it, and it had taken under 2 minutes. On her way out, Maeve crossed the far side of the lobby where the wall was hung with framed photographs, ribbon cuttings and hospital wings and a scholarship dinner, and at the end of the row, larger than the others and set apart with a small brass plate beneath it, there was a portrait of a young woman. Her hand went cold before anything else happened. That was the order of it. The hand first, the fingers going numb around the strap of her bag while her mind was still somewhere behind, still reading the brass plate letter by letter, and by the time the thought arrived, her body had already been standing there for several seconds, knowing. 19 years old in the photograph. Hair set in soft waves by somebody paid to do it. Studio light coming in clean from the left. A string of pearls, a smile with nothing behind it, but the untested confidence of a girl who has never once in her life been afraid of anything. Maeve stood in front of it for a long time, and what she kept coming back to, standing there, was that she could see it, and she could not entirely see it. That if she had walked past this wall as a stranger, she would not have stopped, that the bones were the same, and the mouth was the same, and everything laid over the top of them was different, the weight and the hair and the way the face carried itself. 4 years and 15 pounds, and a scar under the hairline, and a smile that had never once in 4 years been aimed at a camera. She went home. She did not sleep that night or the 2 nights after it. She sat at the table after the others had gone down, and she worked it the way a person works, a problem they cannot afford to be wrong about. And every path she walked came back to the same fork. She did not know who had come into that unit 4 years ago before dawn with clean shoes and asked for a name. She did not know whose money paid for the billboards or who opened the mail at that house. What she did know, with the flat certainty of a woman who had once changed a room code on a Tuesday night, was that if the wrong person heard first, the young woman asleep in the next room would not survive the week, so she did not telephone. She did not write down the address of the row house on Almond Street, or her own name, or the name of the hospital, or anything at all that could be walked back to a door. She took the drawing with the bent bar in it, and she folded it once, and she put it in a plain envelope, with a single line written on the outside in her own hand, and she carried it back to Market Street, and left it at the desk with the young woman who had said the same sentence to her 3 times, and she walked out into the street, and did not look back. The envelope came up to the house with the rest of it on Thursday, and Rocco went through the stack the way he had gone through every stack for 4 years, which was quickly and without hope, because the mail that arrived about his sister had long ago stopped being mail about his sister, and become a kind of weather. He had the plain envelope half turned toward the discard pile when the paper inside slid enough for him to see what was on it. A gate, iron, tall and narrow, the scroll work drawn by somebody who had never been taught to draw. He was already setting it down when his eye went to the bottom of it. 3rd bar in from the left, bent inward and shoved back toward the hinge, gone over twice with the pencil so it sat darker than every other line on the page. He had put that bend in the gate himself at 16 years old, backing a car out of the drive too fast, and his father had refused to have it repaired, and it had stayed exactly that way for 18 years. And the number of people alive on this earth who knew that was too. He turned the envelope over. 1 line on the outside, in a hand he did not recognize. Nothing else. No name, no address, no telephone number. It took his people 4 days to work backward through the front desk and the security tape on Market Street to a woman in a coat, and another 2 to put a name to her. And Rocco did not send anybody to knock on any door, because whoever had sent that envelope had gone to considerable trouble not to be found. And there was only one reason a person did that. He met her himself, in the staff lot behind St. Ambrose Mercy, standing between the ambulance bay and the fence at the hour when the tall lights on their timers begin shutting off one at a time down the row. She came off shift and saw him, and did not slow down and did not speed up. He said her name first. Then he said the amount she owed on her nursing school loans, to the dollar and the cents. He said the month her mother had died. He said the name of the pharmacy on Allegheny Avenue, where she filled the prescriptions, and the name of the nursing home in Frankfurt, where she picked up weekend hours she had never reported to the hospital, and he said all of it in the same flat voice a man uses to read back an order, not one word louder than the one before it. Then he told her that 37 people had taken money from him in 4 years for information about his sister, and he told her what had become of them. And he did not raise his voice for that part either. She let him finish. She said that she had spent 4 years waiting for 2 men with clean shoes to come back, and that she had no idea which side of that he stood on, and that she had sent a piece of paper instead of an address for exactly that reason. He asked her what she wanted. She said the surgery. He said that was not an answer, that everybody wanted something for themselves at the end of it, and he asked her again. She said she was not there to take anything off him. She said a man in his position went through life assuming that fear was a lever he could always reach, and that this only worked on people who still had something left to lose, and that she had a room she was being put out of at the end of the month, a bank account with nothing in it, no family living, and a rejection letter from an insurance company on her table, and that he was welcome to look through all of it and see what he could find to threaten her with. She did not step back once the whole time. Somewhere behind her, another light on the row clicked off. He looked at her for a long moment, and what he was actually doing, though she had no way of knowing it, was looking at the only person in 4 years who had come to him with something and asked for nothing. She told him about the shoes. Not the room, not the chart, not the code she had changed. Only the shoes. Because the shoes were the thing she had never been able to put down in 4 years. 2 men, before the sky went light, saying they were family, standing under the fluorescent tubes in a unit where the floor was scuffed, and everything that came in off the street came in wet or salted or worn, and their leather had not one mark on it, not at the toe, not along the outer edge where a shoe rubs when a man walks any distance at all in this city. She said that she had spent 4 years telling herself she had imagined the significance of that, and 4 years knowing she had not. Rocco did not answer. He stood in the staff lot with his hands in his coat pockets, and looked at the fence for a long time. And what moved through him while he stood there was not grief, and was not shock. It was something much slower and much worse. The sensation of a floor being taken out from under a room he had been living in without ever inspecting it. Somewhere in that stretch, he thought. And it passed through and did not stay. That of the 37 files stacked in his study, there were 11 that had all gone wrong in the same particular direction, and that he had noticed this once, a long time ago, and had turned the page. When he got back in the car, he did not make the call he had made after every single development in 4 years. He did not phone the man who had taught him to read a balance sheet, who kept the ledgers, who came on Thursdays with the pot, and filled his cup and asked whether he had slept. He sat there with the telephone in his hand and did not use it, and he could not have explained to anyone what stopped him, and he did not try to. 2 days later, he came to St. Ambrose Mercy in the middle of the afternoon and went up to the executive floor without an appointment. He was in the chief executive's office for about as long as it takes to boil water and steep a pot of tea. Nobody who worked on that floor heard anything through the door, and the man who came out looked exactly the way he had looked going in, and he did not stop at the desk on his way to the elevator. By 4 o'clock, the determination had been reversed, and the authorization was in the system. And Dr. Hollis Brandt, who had been practicing medicine for 34 years and had learned to keep his own counsel, printed it out and carried it down himself, and handed it to Maeve in the corridor outside the medication room, without any comment beyond the date of the pre-operative workup. She stood there holding it. She read it twice, and what came up through her was not gratitude, or not only that, and it took her a while to find the shape of it, because it was not a feeling she had a name for. 4 years. 4 years of portals and appeals and supplementary forms, of sitting on hold on her own time with the receiver wedged against her shoulder, of being told there was insufficient longitudinal history, of watching a human being reduced to a gap in a record, and none of it had moved 1 inch. And then a man had walked into a room upstairs, and had not raised his voice, and had not, so far as anyone could tell, threatened anybody at all. And the thing had been done before the shift changed. The same building, the same young woman, in the same body, with the same pressure climbing inside her skull. Nothing about her had changed. What had changed was that somebody had said a name out loud that the building recognized. She folded the page in half and put it in the pocket of her scrubs and went back to work. And she carried it around for the rest of the shift. And every so often, moving down that corridor with her hands full, she would feel the paper against her hip and think about all the people in that hospital, on that floor, in that city, who were lying in beds under names that nobody recognized at all. They sat down that Friday in the back room of a banquet hall on Passyunk that had not hosted a wedding in 11 years and was kept open for no reason anybody discussed. 7 men and 1 woman around a table with a paper cloth on it and coffee nobody drank. Bruno Casale took the chair nearest the door because he had taken that chair since before Rocco was old enough to be in the room, 58 years old, thick through the shoulders and gone soft in the middle, warehouses and yard crews. A man who had carried the father's coffin, and who in private, and only in private, still called the head of the family the boy. Nadine Volpe sat across from him, 44, the longshoreman's local, a woman who had never in her working life held a grudge, because grudges cost money, and who went with whichever side kept the port moving. And halfway through, after the routine business was finished, a man there on behalf of the Ferrante interests set his cup down and said, In the pleasant way these things are always said, that with everything the family had been carrying these past 4 years, and with the paperwork at the church now finally behind them, there might be sense in their taking the North River haulage line off Rocco's hands at a fair number, since he had been occupied with private matters, and a line like that suffers when nobody is watching it. The room went very quiet. Rocco did not stand up, and did not lean forward. He asked the man how the Ferrante trucks had been running out of the Bristol yard this winter. The man said fine. Rocco said that was interesting, because 2 of the 3 permits that yard operated under came up for renewal in March, and he said the month the way a man says a date he has already looked up, and then he asked whether they would like him to be occupied with private matters in March as well. Nobody laughed. The man from the Ferrantes said the offer had been made out of respect, and Rocco said he had taken it that way, and that was the end of it. And the meeting moved on to the schedule for the container yard, and nothing further was said about the haulage line by anyone, and not one hand had been laid on anyone. Desmond Falk sat at the far end with the ledgers closed in front of him, and said nothing at all for the entire hour. That was not unusual. He had never spoken in those rooms, because a man who keeps the books does not need to. Afterward, when the chairs had been pushed in, and the others had gone out to the street in twos, he caught Bruno Casale in the corridor by the coats, and said he wanted to show him something, and he set the spending book on the ledge by the coat hooks, and opened it to the tabs he had already marked. 4 years. The retainers, the reward account, the private firms, the sums that had gone out on the strength of a telephone call from a man in Bridesburg with a story about a bus terminal. Bruno put on his glasses. Desmond turned the pages for him, and did not editorialize, and let the columns do it. And when Bruno asked him quietly what he thought was happening to the boy, Desmond said only that grief takes people different ways, and that he had watched this one from close range for 4 years and had begun, lately, to worry. Bruno stood there a long time with his hand flat on the open page. Then he said that somebody who loved the family had to be looking out for him, since the boy would never ask, and Desmond agreed that somebody did, and closed the book, and helped the older man into his coat. He came on foot. He had the car left on Lehigh Avenue with the driver in it, and he walked the last 9 blocks into Kensington alone, past the shuttered storefronts and the shopping cart chained to a railing, and the front steps where people sat out even in the cold, and nobody looked at him twice, because a man in a dark coat with his hands in his pockets is not worth looking at anywhere in this city. Ada Pike answered the door with a cast-iron pan held down along her leg, and told him he could state his business from where he was standing, and Maeve came up behind her and said it was all right, and Ada moved aside about 8 inches and no more, and kept hold of the pan the entire time he was in that house. The room was small enough that 4 adults in it had to arrange themselves. There was the bed against the wall and the table with 2 chairs, and the heater with the newspaper folded under one corner, and there were drawings weighted down under a coffee can on the windowsill, 40 or 50 of them, Gates. All of them Gates. The young woman was sitting on the floor with her back against the bed frame the way she always sat, and she looked up when the door opened, and her face was open and unguarded and entirely without recognition, and she gave him the small, polite smile a person gives a stranger who has come about the plumbing. He had a photograph in his coat that he had carried for 4 years, and he did not take it out. He had rehearsed nothing on the walk over because there had been nothing to rehearse. He stood in the middle of that room and he said her name. Rosalind. That was all. He said it once, quietly, the way you say a word you have not been permitted to use out loud in a long time, and he did not follow it with anything else, and the room stayed exactly as it was. She did not answer. What she did was move. Her weight went back against the bed frame and her shoulders came up, and she slid herself sideways along the floor away from him, 6 inches, then a foot, and her hand went out and took hold of the sleeve of Maeve's coat and closed on it, and she did not let go, and her eyes stayed on him the whole time, and there was nothing in them at all, except the flat animal wariness of a person who has just found out there is somebody in the room they did not agree to. Then she turned her head and asked Maeve who this was. Maeve said his name. She said it was all right. She said it twice more, in the low, even voice she used at 3 in the morning on a floor where somebody was frightened, and she put her own hand over the hand that was gripping her sleeve and left it there, and she did not look up at him while she did it, because she could not. He stood there. That was the whole of it. A man who could stop the loading schedule of a shipping concern for an entire afternoon without placing a call, who had bought a man's debt, and his lease, and his mother's care, and given all of it back to him on one condition, who had spent 4 winters and a fortune and 37 retainers, and had emptied out every corner of the state of Pennsylvania looking for a face, stood in a rented room in Kensington that measured about 12 feet by 10, and discovered the one thing on this earth that was not for sale. She did not know him. There was no negotiation available. There was no permit coming up for renewal in March. He looked at the drawings under the coffee can on the sill, and at the hand holding the sleeve, and at the scar under the hairline at her temple that he had never seen before in his life, and something went out of his face in stages, the way weight comes off a rope. He asked Maeve, and it took him a moment to find the voice for it, whether he might step outside. Maeve said yes. He did not say goodbye to the young woman on the floor, because it would have meant nothing to her, and he understood that now. He went out through the door Ada Pike was still standing at, and down the 3 steps and sat on the concrete stoop with his forearms on his knees, hatless, in the cold, in front of a row house on a block where the streetlight 2 doors down had been out since spring. Gideon Marsh had brought the car around and was parked across the street by then, and he sat behind the wheel and watched the most feared man in Philadelphia sit on a stranger's front step with his head down and his hands hanging between his knees, and he did not get out, and he did not say one word about it, then or ever. After the man in the dark coat was gone, she sat where she was for a while. Her hand was still closed on the coat sleeve. She made it let go. Then she got up and went to the window and stood there and did not say anything, and Maeve did not ask her anything, and that was the arrangement they had. What nobody in that room knew was that she had begun remembering months ago. Not the way it happens in films. There was no story. There was no morning where a life came back to her in order. What came were pieces, and they came without warning, and they came through her body before they came through her head. A gate, that one arrived first, and it arrived complete, tall and narrow, iron worked into curves, and she could feel the cold of it in the palm of her hand, as if she had just let go of it. Then, a smell, something a man puts on his face after shaving, sharp and clean, and a little sweet underneath. That one came in the pharmacy on Allegheny Avenue, in the aisle with the shaving things, and she had to hold the shelf. And then, later, a voice, a man's voice, low, pleasant, saying a name to her that was not the name on her card, and not the name Maeve used. A short name, a small name, the kind of name somebody gives a child and keeps using after the child has stopped being one. She could hear how it was said. She could not hear who was saying it. And here was the thing she never told anyone. When that name arrived in her, what came with it was cold water, not a place, not an event, not anything she could have described to a doctor or written down on a form. Just cold, all through her, in her chest and behind her teeth, the way cold gets into a body and stays there. Every time, the name and the cold arrived together and could not be separated, and after the 3rd or 4th time she stopped trying to separate them and drew her own conclusion, which was simple, and which she held to. Somewhere out there was a man who had said that name to her, and if she kept pulling, she would find him, and if she found him, he would find her, so she stopped pulling. That was the first reason. The second reason was quieter, and she was more ashamed of it. If she remembered, there would be people. There would be a house somewhere and a family somewhere and papers to sign, and somebody would come and take her, and it would all be very kind. And at the end of it, a woman would walk back into a rented room on Almond Street, and there would be nobody in it. She knew what Maeve had. She knew the whole inventory. A job, a pan of soup on the table, an old woman asleep in the chair, and her. That was all of it. She had watched for 4 years, and she had never once seen anybody else come up those steps, so she kept it in. But she could not stop it, and it kept coming, so she did the only thing she could think of. She drew the gate, over and over, on envelopes and pamphlet margins and the $2 notebook, and every time she drew it she was doing the same private test, holding a piece of the truth in her hands to see how much of it she could carry that day without the cold coming up. Some days a great deal, some days almost none. And then in the fall she started getting worse. She could feel it. The episodes were coming closer together and she was tired in a way sleep did not touch, and she saw how Maeve's face changed when the doctor talked, and she began to do her own arithmetic. If she was going to be a weight, she did not want to be a weight for the rest of a life. So on that Saturday afternoon, with the light coming in yellow and flat, she drew the gate one more time, and then she went further than she had ever let herself go, and she put in the bar down at the bottom, third one in from the left, bent inward and shoved back toward the hinge. She went over it twice, so it would be dark. Then she put the pencil down, and she waited. And she did not look up. And she let the woman who had never left her picked that piece of paper up off the floor. It was the 11 files that took him there. He went back through them himself, on the floor of the study with the folders open in a ring around him, and this time he did not turn the page. And by the second night he had found what they had in common, which was not a name in the text, but a name in the expense lines. A man who had been sat down with by 11 different investigators over 4 years, and had told all 11 of them the same useless thing. Holland Voss, 61 years old, a yard foreman on the docks for 29 of them, and when Rocco found him, he was in the palliative unit at a facility out past Torresdale, with an oxygen line taped to his cheek and a chart at the foot of the bed that said, what a chart says when the treating team has stopped counting in months. The dust had taken his lungs. He had a window that looked at a parking lot, and no photographs on the sill, and nobody in the chair. He knew who had come in before Rocco had said anything. He said the name, and then he said that he had been waiting 4 years for somebody to walk through that door, and that he was glad it had happened while he could still get the words out. He told it slowly, because that was the only speed he had left. Desmond Falk had sent him. He said the sentence flat, without preamble, the way a man puts down something he has been holding too long. He was the one who was supposed to go, and he went, and he had done other things in his life for that house, and he had never once refused, and then he could not do it. That was all the account he gave of it. He could not do it. What he did instead was pull her out. Then he walked up off the pier to the phone booth on the corner by the shipping office, the one that had already been broken twice that year, and he called for an ambulance, and did not give his name, and did not stay to meet it, and he stood in the dark far enough back to see the lights come, and then he went home. And in the morning he reported that it was done. From that day forward there was only one job. The girl was alive. And the only reason she was alive was that Desmond Falk believed she was not. And if any single person on this earth found her and said so out loud, Desmond would be at that door before her brother would. So Voss made sure nobody found her. 11 times over 4 years he sat down across a table in the coffee shop by the fish wharf with a man holding a folder. And he looked that man in the face, and he lied to him, and he sent him north when the answer was south, and he gave him a name that would eat 6 weeks, and he watched him write it down. He did that to 11 men who were being paid by a brother to find his sister. He knew what it was doing to that brother. He said so. He said he had seen the billboards go up, and he had driven past them on his way to the yard, and there had been mornings he had to pull over. But there was no version of it he could find where a man like Desmond did not get there first, and so he kept doing the only thing he knew how to do, which was to keep everyone in the world away from her, including the one man who wanted her back more than anyone alive. He did not apologize. He did not ask to be forgiven, and he did not explain himself past that. And when he was finished, he lay there breathing with the line taped to his cheek and let it stand. Rocco did not speak for a long time. When Voss did speak again, it was to ask one question, and it was not about the family, and it was not about what would happen to him now, and it was not about the time he had left. He wanted to know whether the girl could talk. Rocco said that she could. Voss closed his eyes and lay there with that for a while. Then he said that there was a man from the government who had come to see him twice about the port, and that he had sent him away both times, and that if somebody wanted him to say all of this again, in a room with a recorder running, they had better not take too long about it. He drove back from Torresdale, and he did not go home. He went to the study, and he took the oldest folder off the bottom of the stack, the first one, the one that had been assembled in the first week, and he sat down with it under the lamp. Maeve had come at his asking and was standing near the door with her coat still on. The descriptive circular was the second page in, one sheet. It had gone out to the state police, and to every agency and every firm and every newsroom in 3 states, and it had been the basis of the reward notice, and the wording on the billboards had been taken from it, and it had been prepared in that first week by the office that handled such things, and brought to him for his signature, and he had signed it. He remembered signing it. He did not remember reading it, because that week he had not been able to hold a line of text in his head from one end to the other, and people had put pages in front of him, and he had put his name on them. Now he read it. Height, weight, hair, and then, on the 4th line down, in the same plain type as everything else, the description of the eyes. Brown. He read that word. He read it again. He sat there with the lamp on, and the page flat on the desk under both hands, and he read the word brown 4 or 5 times, and then he stopped moving altogether. His sister's eyes were gray, not hazel, not light brown, not something a person could argue about in bad lighting. Gray, the same as his own, the same as their mother's. The one feature in that family that anybody who had ever sat across a table from the two of them had remarked on. And it had gone out on one line of one sheet in the first week. And after that, everything in the world had been built on top of it. 37 investigators had worked from that circular. Every one of them had carried it in a folder and read it in a car and worked from the description in it. And it had been sent to hospitals and shelters and county offices and to police departments up and down the corridor. And it had been read aloud on the radio. And it had been printed on the boards that stood along the riverfront avenue through 4 winters. So that every driver on that road and every person waiting at every light beneath them had been told, over and over, for 4 years, in letters 4 feet high, to look for a young woman with brown eyes. And she had walked underneath them. She had stood at those lights. She had been in the pharmacy and the community center and the corridors of a public hospital, in the open, in daylight, in the same city, and the whole apparatus had looked directly at her and had gone past, because the apparatus had been given one wrong word and had never once been asked to check it. He had paid for the boards. He had paid for the circular and the reward and every one of the 37 retainers. He had spent 4 years in a fortune building, with his own hands and his own signature, the thing that had kept his sister hidden from him. He did not say any of that out loud. He sat very still with the page under his hands, and it was quiet enough in that room to hear the lamp. And Maeve, standing by the door, watching him, felt something come up out of her own memory and settle, and it took her a moment to place it, and when she placed it, she had to put a hand on the frame, the second year, a wet evening on the avenue with the traffic stopped, and a board above her with a face on it, and how long she had sat there looking up at it before the light changed. She had gone home that night and stood in the doorway of that room with her keys still in her hand, and looked at the young woman on the floor with the pencil, and looked at her carefully, in the lamplight, at her eyes, and had thought, no, it is not her, and had stopped wondering, and had not wondered again for 2 more years. It went up in the darkest hour of the night, when the block was down to the sound of one car alarm somewhere over toward the avenue, and by the time the engines had backed out of Almond Street, the middle 3 houses of the row were open to the sky, and everyone who lived in them was standing on the far sidewalk in whatever they had been wearing. Nobody was hurt. That was the first thing the captain said, and the only thing anybody wanted to know. What was gone was everything else. 4 years of clothes bought $2 at a time off the racks at the thrift store on Kensington Avenue. The good coat June wore to the Saturday class, the $2 spiral notebook, and the coffee can, and every drawing under it. A guardianship file in a cardboard folder, the paperwork for the appeal window, and in a frame that had sat face down in a drawer for 11 years, because Maeve could not have it out, and could not throw it away, the only photograph in existence of her mother, taken on a porch in Fishtown in the summer before anything was wrong. There had been one copy. Ada Pike stood on the sidewalk in her housecoat with her arms folded, and when Maeve put her own coat around the old woman's shoulders, a rubber band gave out, and a fold of paper came loose from the housecoat pocket and went down onto the wet pavement, and Maeve picked it up before she thought about it. Receipts. 2 years of them, from the pharmacy on Allegheny Avenue, in a stack a half-inch thick, the anticonvulsant, month after month after month, in a name that was not June Doe and was not Maeve Donnelly. Maeve turned them over in her hands under the streetlight, and then looked up. Ada took them back and put them in the other pocket, and said that a person could not sit in a chair in a room and watch and do nothing, and that she had no grandchildren and no prospect of any, and that money in a bank account does not do anything at all except sit there being money. And then she said that the sidewalk was cold and they ought to go. They went to the old convalescent annex behind St. Ambrose Mercy. 4 floors of 1920s brick, with the windows boarded on the ground level and a demolition notice zip-tied to the fence. The building where June had spent her first months when there was still a state facility to be sent onto. Maeve had a keycard in the bottom of her bag that had never been collected when the annex closed, and it still opened the service door on the north side, and she brought them in through it, and up to the 2nd floor, where there was a room with a bed frame in it, and running water in the corridor. Rocco followed her the whole way. He had come within 20 minutes of the call, and he had not asked one question about where they were going, and it did not appear to occur to either of them that a man who owned a pier and 3 warehouses, and a house that took up half a block, might have had a better idea. She knew this building. That was the entire reason. The seizure came on a little after 2 in the morning. Maeve was down on the floor before anybody else had registered anything, moving the bed frame back with her hip. and the man who could stop a shipping company's loading schedule for an entire afternoon without placing a telephone call went down on his knees on the other side and then stopped, because he had no idea what to do with his hands. They hovered. They went out and came back. He looked for something to hold, and there was nothing. And he was, for the first time in his adult life, a person standing in a room where the work was happening and having nothing to offer it. Then a hand came across and took him by the wrist, and moved his hand, and put it flat on his sister's shoulder, and held it there until it stayed on its own, and then Maeve's hand went back to what it was doing. He knelt on that floor with his palm on her shoulder for the length of it, and did not move it once. And when it was over, and the breathing had gone long and slow and the room had gone quiet, he waited until Maeve had folded her coat under his sister's head, and then he took his hand back. They sat in the corridor outside the room with their backs against the tile wall, because there was nowhere else in that building to sit, and Ada had gone down at last on the far bed, and the only light was what came up the stairwell from the service door. He started talking somewhere around 3 a.m, and he did not look at her while he did it. He said that he had spent 4 years paying people to look for his sister, and that every single one of them had been better off not finding her. The firms billed by the hour, and an open file is an annuity, and a closed one is a sales call in a month's time. The men who came with information were selling hope by the piece, and hope by the piece has a market, and the market only exists while the thing is still lost. He said he had known all of that in some abstract way the whole time, and had not let himself hold it, because the alternative to paying them was doing nothing, and he could not do nothing. And every one of those invoices, 4 years of them, had gone across one desk and come back approved with initials in the corner, and the hand that put those initials there belonged to the man who had taught him to read a balance sheet when he was 22 years old, and had just buried his father, and could not sit still in a chair for longer than 4 minutes at a time. He said there were something like 300 people who took money in that family's name. He said he had sat in the car outside the annex that night going through them one at a time, and that he had not been able to come up with a single name, not one, that he would have handed his sister's life to. Then he was quiet for a while, and then he told her the last of it. Rosalind had been 19, and doing a stretch of hours in the office at the haulage company that summer, filing, learning the business the way their father had wanted, and she had found a second set of books, 2 of everything. Cargo moving through that port that had never been declared to anybody, going back years. She telephoned him about it on a Tuesday night at 11 o'clock, at the hour she knew perfectly well he never picked up, which is what a person does when they are frightened of what they know and want to be talked out of it. He picked up anyway, because it was her. She said she needed to tell him something, and that it could not be done over a telephone. He said tomorrow. He did not add anything to that. He let the 2 words sit in the corridor, and he did not decorate them. Maeve did not say anything for a long moment. Then she said that since they were doing this, she would tell him her part, and she told it looking straight ahead at the opposite wall. She said she had spent 4 years telling herself that she kept that young woman because it was not safe to do anything else, and that this was true. And she said it was not the whole truth. She said her mother had died when she was 21, and there had been nobody after that. No aunt, no cousin she spoke to, no one to call on a holiday, and that she had gone 11 days a month, sometimes without saying a word to another human being outside of a hospital corridor. And then there had been a person in her room who did not know her own name, who needed her for everything, and who could not leave. She said the honest word for what that did for her was not something she liked to look at. She asked him whether that made her the one who saved her, or the one who kept her. And she said she had been carrying that question for 4 years, and had never once had anybody to ask it to. He did not answer it. He did not tell her she was being hard on herself. He let it stand the way she had let his stand. Near dawn he made her an offer. New names for both of them. A state a long way from here. People on the door. Everything paid. She said no before he had finished. She said she was not a thing to be put somewhere safe, and she was not going to be moved around a map by a man because it made his own chest easier, and that the young woman asleep in that room was not property being recovered, and that whatever came next, June would be asked first, and she would be asked second, and he would be told. She said all of it in the same flat voice she used at 3 a.m. on a floor where somebody was frightened. He looked at her for a moment in the gray light. Then he said, "All right." The medication had been in the house on Almond Street, and the house on Almond Street was gone, and the dose could not be interrupted, and a pharmacy will not hand over a controlled anticonvulsant on the word of a woman standing at the counter in yesterday's scrubs. It had to be reissued off the record, and the record was where it had always been, 4 years deep, filed under the name that had been entered on the night of the admission, one letter off from the name on the county card. Maeve had built her whole life on top of that letter. She had never once had to touch the original chart, because June Doe had a card and a guardian and a clinic file of her own, and the two had run alongside each other like two rails that never meet, but the prescription history was on the old side. So on Thursday morning, she sat down at a terminal on the 3rd floor of St. Ambrose Mercy, logged in with her own credentials, and pulled the original admission record. What she did not know, because it had been announced in a staff email in April that she had read the way everybody reads those, was that the hospital had gone live that spring on a new electronic records platform, and that one of the things the vendor had sold the board on was a reconciliation engine that scanned the legacy archive for duplicate patient entries created by transcription and spelling errors and merged them automatically against the BELLUS demographic index. It had been quietly doing this for 4 months. It had merged 11,000 records across 3 decades. It hit hers the moment she opened it. There was no warning box and no confirmation prompt. The screen refreshed and the header changed, and the name at the top of the chart was the right one, the one printed under a portrait on a wall on Market Street, and beneath it, the system had stitched 4 years of clinic notes to a single night in an emergency department, and it had done it correctly, and it had done it in under 2 seconds. Maeve sat looking at the screen. She had not made a mistake. That was the part she would come back to later, at odd hours, for the rest of her life. She had followed the process exactly. She had used her own login on her own hospital's system to obtain a lawful prescription for a patient in her legal care, and a piece of software had done precisely the job it was purchased to do. 4 years late, the merge generated a duplicate reconciliation notice. Those notices go to Health Information Management, because somebody has to sign off on them, and they go in a queue, and the queue is worked by clerks. By noon, it had been opened by a man in the records department on the ground floor who had been on the family's payroll since long before any of this, in the low, unremarkable way that a shipping town has always had people here and there, and who had been given one instruction 4 years ago and had never expected it to come to anything. He made one call. Desmond Falk received it at his desk and set the telephone down and sat for a while with his hands flat on the blotter. 4 years he had believed she was in the river. 4 years he had run the search, approved the retainers, initialed the invoices, and slept. And now he knew, and every man he had ever used was one telephone call away. And there was a girl in a building somewhere in this city who could put a name to a voice. He did not make that call. He did not send anybody anywhere, because a girl coming to harm now, with a brother already off the reservation and asking questions about 11 old files, would not close anything. It would open everything. And Desmond Falk had not survived 30 years in that house by solving problems in ways that leave a shape behind. He needed the thing done properly. He needed it done by the family itself, in a room, with hands going up around a table. He needed the boy, declared unfit, and once the boy was unfit, everything under him became a matter of administration, and administration was his. He put on his coat and drove out to Bruno Casale's house in the northeast, with the spending book on the passenger seat beside him, and he sat at that kitchen table for 2 hours, turning pages, saying almost nothing, letting an old man with reading glasses go down the columns himself. He showed him the 4 years. He showed him the money. And then, near the end, he mentioned, with reluctance, that the boy had been seen going into a row house in Kensington alone and on foot, that he had pulled his own people off their posts to sit on a hospital annex, and that there was a young woman involved whose situation nobody had been able to explain to him satisfactorily. Bruno took his glasses off and rubbed his eyes for a long moment. Then he said he would put it to the table. 2 miles south, in a federal building near 6th Street, a special agent named Corinne Boyd had been building a racketeering case on that port for 2 years and had every piece of it except a voice. She had gone out to a palliative unit in Torresdale twice and had been sent away twice, and she was still waiting on exactly one person to decide to talk. Bruno Casale would not vote on hearsay. He said so on the telephone, and he said it the way a man says a thing he considers to be simple decency, that he had known that family for 40 years, and he was not going to sit at a table and put his hand up about the boy's fitness on the strength of a spending book and a story about a row house, and that if there was a young woman, then he would go and look at the young woman himself, and then he would decide. Rocco agreed to it. He had no way not to agree to it, And there was a part of him, a part he did not examine closely, that wanted the old man in that room. Desmond Falk came too. He was not asked, and he did not ask. He simply got into the car with the ledger case on his knees, because a man who is frightened of a room does not go to it, and everyone would notice which way he went. They came up the service stairs of the annex on a Sunday afternoon, with the light coming gray through the boarded windows on the landings. Bruno first with his hand on the rail, then Desmond, then Rocco, and Maeve met them at the top, and did not step aside until Rocco nodded to her. June was sitting on the floor with her back against the wall by the radiator, drawing on the back of a supply requisition form because it was the only paper in the building. She looked up when the door opened. She looked at Bruno without recognition, and with no fear at all, the way she looked at everyone, and Bruno stopped where he was, and took his hat off, and stood there with it in both hands. And then Desmond came into the room behind him. He did what he always did, which was to smile first, before he spoke, a small, courteous smile of the kind that costs a man nothing and puts a room at its ease. And then, in that quiet, pleasant, unhurried voice, he said hello to her. The drawing hand stopped. Everything about her stopped. She did not make a sound, and she did not stand up. Her breathing went out of her and did not come back for a moment, and her chin came up an inch and stayed, and the color went out from around her mouth, and her arm went out sideways along the floor, groping, and found the hem of Maeve's coat and closed on it, and she pushed herself backward along the wall until her shoulders were flat against the plaster, and there was nowhere further to go. And she stayed there, looking at the man in the gray wool vest, with an expression that nobody in that room had ever seen on her face before. It was not the wariness she gave to strangers. Every one of them had seen that. This was different in kind, and it was old, and it had been living somewhere in her for 4 years. And what was happening inside her, though she could not have said one word of it aloud, was that the voice had arrived, the voice from the pharmacy aisle and the cold, the voice that had a small name in it, a short, affectionate name that had been given to a child and never put down after she stopped being one. She had believed for months that the voice belonged to somebody who was looking for her. She had believed, since the man in the dark coat had come into a rented room and said Rosalind, that the two might be the same person, and she had been unable to make it fit. And now the pieces went together with an accuracy that made her whole body understand before her mind had assembled a single sentence. The voice had never been her brother's. It belonged to the man who had known her since before she could walk, who had taught her to read her first column of figures at a dining table with a pencil in his hand, who had been at every birthday and every Christmas and every funeral, who had sat at that table so many thousands of times that he had stopped being a guest in that house decades ago. Rocco saw his sister go back against the wall, and he saw where she was looking, and something in his face closed like a door. Maeve went down on the floor beside her and put herself between, without hurrying, the way she did everything, and June's hand stayed shut on her coat. Desmond did not move and did not speak again, and did not look at Bruno. He kept the small smile exactly where it had been, and that was, in the end, the worst thing about him. Bruno Casali had held this young woman in his own arms when she was 5 days old, in the front room of the house on Fitzwater Street, with her father standing over him telling him to mind her head. He did not ask anybody a question. He took his glasses off, and he got out his handkerchief, and he stood in the middle of that cold room, cleaning them, very slowly, for a long time. They sat down again in the back room on Passyunk on a Wednesday afternoon, the same paper cloth on the same table, the same coffee nobody touched, and Rocco came in knowing exactly what the two roads were. He could deny all of it. He could say there was no young woman and no row house and no annex, and the table would take his word because his word had never once been bad in 12 years, and he would keep the port and the pier and the warehouses and the whole apparatus of the name, and his sister would go back into the ground she had already been buried in on paper, and he would lose her a second time, and this time by his own hand. Or he could tell them, and lose everything he had before the room emptied. He sat down. He said that his sister was alive. He let that go all the way around the table before he said anything else, and he watched it land on 7 faces, and then he did the 2 things he had come to do. He said that she had a brain injury, and no memory of anything before 4 years ago, that she could not name a street, or a company, or a person, that she had been examined by physicians who would say so, and that she was, as a witness to anything at all, worth precisely nothing to anybody in that room. And then he opened the case he had brought and put his own books on the table. All of them, the real ones. 4 years of the port, the haulage line, the arrangements, every column that mattered, sitting face up on a paper tablecloth in front of 7 people who could destroy him with a photograph of it. He said that any man who thought his sister was worth touching should understand that the exposure in this room was now his and not hers, and that he had just handed each of them a great deal more leverage over him than a girl who could not remember her own surname would ever be. Nobody spoke for a while. What he had done was to make her worthless, and himself worth taking. In one motion, in front of everybody, and every person at that table understood the arithmetic of it, and understood what it had cost, and not one of them had ever seen it done before. Then he turned to the far end. He said Desmond Falk's name, and he did not raise his voice for any part of what followed. He laid it out in order, the second set of books that a 19-year-old girl had found in an office one summer, the 4 years of retainers approved with initials in the corner, the 11 files, the man in Torresdale with the oxygen line taped to his cheek, who was prepared to say all of it again with a recorder running. He did not accuse him of anything. He could not put a page behind, and he put the pages down one at a time as he went. And then he said the last part, which was the part that mattered. He said that Desmond Falk had eaten at his father's table for 30 years, that he had stood at that man's funeral and been given the chair he sat in that day by the family, and that as of this afternoon he had no chair, no book, no account, no percentage, no introduction, and no standing to speak to any man in that room or any man they knew, and that from this day, the name he had used in this city for 3 decades was not his to use. He said it flatly and completely, the way you read out an inventory, and every man there understood that he was watching a person being erased rather than harmed, and that the second was the lesser thing. Then, and only then, he had him taken out to the car. Bruno had gone gray. When the vote came, it went the way Rocco had known it would go, from the moment he decided which road to take. Nadine Volpe put her hand up against him without any pleasure in it, and without any apology either, because a port that is about to be opened up by federal accountants is a port that stops moving, and she had 1,100 men on a book who worked when it moved. And there was nothing personal in it, and she did not pretend otherwise. The man from the Ferrante interests put his hand up too, and had been waiting 4 years to do it. It came down to the old man at the end. Bruno Casale sat with his hands flat on the paper cloth for a long moment, looking at the books that were still lying open in front of him. And then he looked up at the boy he had carried a coffin for, and he said, out loud, that he had held that girl when she was 5 days old, and that he was not going to be the last man in this city to choose the family over her. And he put his hand up. 7 of 7. Rocco stood, and thanked them, and buttoned his coat, and walked out of that room with nothing at all. A man who has been erased has nothing left to protect, and Desmond Falk understood before the car had reached the end of Passyunk that the only thing standing between him and a federal courtroom was a dying yard foreman in Torresdale and a young woman in a boarded-up building who had gone back, against a wall at the sound of his voice. He did not go home. Rocco came out of that room and made 2 calls, and the first one was to Gideon Marsh, and by the time the sky over the port had begun to go the color of tin, Gideon had brought the car up to the north loading door of the annex and taken June and Ada Pike out through it and away, both of them in the back seat with the doors locked, off that block entirely, before anything else happened in that building. That mattered. When it started, there were 4 adults inside and nobody else. Maeve heard the exterior door on the east side give first, the one with the chain that had been cut and rehung so many times the frame no longer held. She did not wait to find out how many. She took Rocco by the sleeve and went. She knew this building the way she knew her own hands. She had worked it for 2 years before it closed, and had come back to it every week for 14 months after. She took him down the back stairwell to the basement, and into the low tiled tunnel that had carried stretchers between the annex and the main hospital, before either building had elevators worth the name, and she went along it fast and quiet with one hand out on the pipe rail. Behind them, voices in the stairwell. She turned left where the tunnel branched, and did not slow down. Up the service stair, through the laundry room. She stopped him at the chute with a flat hand on his chest, listened, moved. At the freight elevator, she put her card against the reader and said, without looking at him, "Do not let go of the key. It stops on 3. And he held it, and it did not stop on 3. On the 4th floor, she took him past the fire door and told him not to touch it, that it screamed, that everyone who had ever worked that floor knew it. They went the long way instead, through the old day room with the chairs still stacked against the wall. And somewhere in the middle of all that, moving in the dark, with a man behind her doing exactly what she said, she noticed that her hands were steady, that the shaking in her breath, which had been there since the night on Almond Street, had stopped. She was not afraid. She was working. They came out at the ambulance bay of the main hospital, at the concrete apron under the canopy, and 4 things closed at once. The overhead paging system was live, because Maeve had lifted a wall handset in the corridor on the way past and had not hung it up, and every word spoken under that canopy was going out to every ward in St. Ambrose Mercy. A unit was parked in the bay with its engine running and its forward camera streaming, as those cameras always are, to the dispatch center across the river. Special Agent Corinne Boyd was standing at the mouth of the bay with 6 people and had been standing there for an hour and 40 minutes, because a man in a palliative unit in Torresdale had finally sent word that he was ready to talk and had told her where this would end. And on the recorder in her hand was a call pulled from the haulage company's own switchboard archive, 4 years old, one voice giving one instruction about the owner's sister, retained by a system that logged everything and had been logging it for decades because the insurers required it. Desmond came out of the stairwell into the light and saw all of it. He took hold of Maeve's wrist. Rocco crossed the distance and put him against the concrete wall of the bay, one movement, and held him there. Then he let go and took him by the arm and set him back on his feet. Nobody drew anything, because nobody there had anything to draw. Corinne Boyd read him his rights under the canopy lights, with the paging system carrying every syllable of it into 40 wards, and 2 floors up, on a corridor where a night shift had stopped dead in its tracks to listen. A nurse who had worked with Maeve Donnelly for 9 years put her hand over her mouth. The price came due over the following winter, and he paid all of it. He sat with federal attorneys for 11 days and gave them the port, the haulage line, the second books, 30 years of arrangements, names he had known his whole life. The pier went. The warehouses went. The house on the south side, with the windows set deep in the stone, was sold under a forfeiture order, and the long table went out the front door on a Tuesday morning in the rain, and the money that had bought a $500,000 reward and 37 retainers ceased to exist in any form he could touch. He was sentenced to 14 months. Whatever he had been in this city on the morning he signed that petition, he was not it anymore, and men who had once waited in the cold with their hands in their pockets rather than ask him a question now said his name out loud in restaurants. The surgery was done in November. Dr. Hollis Brandt did what he had said he would do, and the pressure came down, and the episodes spaced out, and there was, for the first time in 4 years, a direction that was not downward. And then there were 3 months of recovery, and at the end of them the truth about that kind of injury was exactly what it had been at the beginning, which is that the scarring does not reverse, and the years do not come back on request. She remembered the gate. She remembered the cold of the iron in her palm, and the bend in the 3rd bar, and the name that had been said to her at a dining table. She could not remember her mother's face. She was shown photographs, and she looked at them for a long time, and she was honest about it. And she said that she could see a woman, and that she believed the woman was hers, and that nothing arrived. It never did. Nothing in that hospital or any hospital was going to hand it back to her, and everybody in the room understood that, and nobody pretended otherwise. What she asked for instead, when they came with the forms to restore her legal identity, was to keep both names. She said she had been Rosalind for 19 years, and she did not remember them, and she had been June for 4, and she remembered all of them, and she was not going to sign away the only part of her life she could actually account for. They put both on the paper. Maeve signed the transfer of guardianship on a Thursday. She did the paperwork at the county office in the morning, and she came to the hospital in the afternoon, and she sat for a while on the edge of the bed, and then she went out, and she did not come back. Rocco arrived that evening, and found the bed made up, and the room quiet, and his sister asleep, and on the blanket a cardboard-covered composition book, 4 years thick, the spine reinforced with tape 3 separate times. He stood by the window and turned the pages. Every episode in 4 years, logged by shift rather than by clock, with the dose and the duration and what had come before it. Foods she could not keep down, listed and dated, and crossed out as they changed. The one song that would put her to sleep, written at the top of a page in block capitals and underlined twice, and near the back, in handwriting that had gotten smaller over the years. On a Tuesday in the 2nd winter. 4 words. She laughed twice today. Under the book, folded once, there was a sheet of paper, and beneath the paper, holding it flat, a hair clip with green enamel across the top and a crack running through it, the one thing that had been in the pocket of a coat 4 years ago and had come out of the river with her. The note was 3 sentences long. It said that she had only ever been holding these things for somebody else, and that they were his now, and that she was asking him for one thing in return, which was that he not look for her the way he had looked for his sister. He read it standing up. Then he sat down in the chair beside the bed and he stayed there all night, with the composition book open on his knees and his hand flat on the page. And he did not send anybody anywhere. He did not hire anyone. He had the means to find her inside of a week even after the forfeiture, and he knew exactly which door to knock on and which office kept which record, and he did none of it. He served the 14 months and came out in the spring and went to work for a man he had once owned a pier next to. And he waited, which was a thing he had never in his life been asked to do and had no talent for, and he learned it the way people learn things late, badly and completely. The river went brown with runoff, and then flat and green through the summer, and then the color of slate, and then the ice came in along the edges by the piers, and then it went out again, and the whole cycle turned once and started over. It was near the end of that second turn that his sister said, out of nothing, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, 2 words. She said Maeve, and then she said, again, more certainly, Maeve, and put her hand out for a piece of paper. They found her in a county out west where the mushroom houses are, working out of a mobile clinic parked behind a feed store, sleeves pushed up past her elbows, taking blood pressures down a line of 40 farm workers who did not have insurance and were not going to get any, moving down that line the way she had once moved down a corridor at 3 in the morning. She looked up and saw the 2 of them standing at the end of the lot, and she did not say anything for a moment. And then she finished the cuff she was in the middle of, because you always finish the cuff you are in the middle of. Afterward, the 3 of them sat out back with coffee poured from a dented steel carafe, on plastic milk crates turned upside down. In the last of the afternoon light, he did not offer her money. He had none to offer, and would not have offered it anyway. What he told her about instead was a clinic, small, 2 floors of a building in Port Richmond, paid for out of what he earned and what he had been left with, for people recovering from brain injury, and for patients who arrive at a hospital with no name attached to them. His name was not on the building. He did not sit on its board, and had asked not to be put on it. And the first rule of that clinic, written into its intake policy in plain language, was that every unidentified patient was given a name and a bound notebook on the day they arrived, and that both stayed with them, kept up in somebody's handwriting, until the day their own name was found again. He asked her to run the clinical side of it. She took a long time answering, and then she said yes. In the waiting room on the ground floor there is a window that takes the western light all afternoon, and on Saturdays a woman who answers to 2 names sets out paper and wax crayons on the low table there and sits down with whoever has come in with their parents. And one of the volunteers who has worked that room for years sits with them. She still draws the gate. She drew it that afternoon, tall and narrow, the ironwork curling back on itself, and every bar in it straight. Beside her, a small boy was working on a dog, coloring it green with great concentration, and when the woman across the table asked him about it, he explained, patiently, that his own dog at home was exactly that color, and always had been, and the laughing carried out into the corridor. Rocco and Maeve heard it from the front steps where they were sitting, and his sister came out after a while and sat down on the step below them with wax on 2 of her fingers, and none of them said anything at all. What that clinic understood, and what it took 4 winters and a fortune, and the loss of everything to teach one man, is that a person is never truly lost as long as one other human being is still willing to look at them and actually see them. Money could not do it. Power could not do it. Attention did. If this story moved you, please give it a like and share it with someone you love. And subscribe to our channel so you can hear stories like this one with us every day. We would truly like to know how this story landed for you. So tell us in the comments what you felt while you were listening, because those words from your heart are the reason we keep making these. Wishing you good health, a peaceful mind, and quiet joy in your days. Goodbye for now, and we will see you in the next video.